Please join me in welcoming Garry Kasparov and Dambisa Moyo.
Good evening. I guess it's only in New York you can have a Zambian economist and Russian chess champion discussing how to save democracy. And I have to add that I'm quite happy that Dambisa will be doing most of talking tonight, because Americans these days are quite worried about Russian meddling in your politics. It's a new book, Age of Chaos, and of course I couldn't miss one of the quotes in the book that is connected to chess, believe it or not. And I think it's a good...
Why did I put this in?
No, thank you very much, because I didn't know about it, and I can bet you I will use it all the time. So it's about US Navy SEAL program. Not only 20% of trainees for the US Navy SEAL program make it through. 80% drop out. And the study said, quote, the top indicator of success was a high level of expertise in chess. Chess players are strategic thinkers who see beyond the next move or the next challenge. They were the ones who succeeded in a long, demanding, grueling Navy SEAL program. The winning cohort were not focused on what would happen after breakfast or lunch. They were mentally focused on the days or weeks ahead, already assessing how to be in the best position to overcome a future challenge. Unfortunately, I'm a little too old to join the Navy SEAL program. But now, it's important that chess is an indicator, and I think it's about one of the key elements of your book. Your argument is, everything now is tilted towards short-term thinking. And the problems that you raised, the signal, most of them, if not all, require long-term thinking. So tell us, so why it's happening and what can we do about it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you to the New York Public Library, and thank you, Garry. I was absolutely thrilled when I heard that Garry was willing to interview me. I actually was told that he was excited to interview me, so I jumped on the opportunity. But it's a delight to be here. So the question of long-term thinking, I believe, is actually right at the heart of the debate of democracy. For economists, there are 6 very, very deep headwinds that are structural, intergenerational, and long-term that are threatening to upend the global economy. This is everything from the shift in global demographics. Today, we're about 7.5 billion people on the planet. The world's population will continue to grow apace until 2100, when there'll be 11 billion people. Countries like India are adding 1 million people a month to the population. And the real issues that we see in terms of quality and quantity of the world's population, I think, are significantly risking or threatening to upend and challenge the global economy. But there are other issues that are long-term, issues around the amount of debt that economies are carrying, but also technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, concerns about income inequality, natural resource scarcity, and of course, for the economists in the room, you'll be familiar with this concern that productivity, the output per unit of our work, is actually declining and has been declining over several decades. All of these issues are long-term, they're deeply structural, and they require trade-offs between today's generation and future generations. However, the policymakers and the politicians who we've elected to basically represent us and focus on solving these problems are incredibly short-term, and very rationally so. So it's not that they are sort of evil, they are rationally courting and catering today's voters, and this creates a schism or mismatch between the long-term economic challenges and the short-termism. And that actually means that we're not solving these problems, and actually they're becoming much worse.
So what comes first, politics or economy?
Well, it's interesting. As an economist, I'd like to say it's economics, but the reason I've written this book is born out of frustration. Frustration because I've realized that actually as economists, we can't do anything, we can't do our jobs, because we keep getting usurped by the politics. And unfortunately, the consequences of that, I think, are quite dire.
No, I like to complain that in the last 50 years, we could see the movement of the talent from space engineering to financial engineering. And I always say I hope that AI will kill enough jobs in financial sector to move kids back to space engineering. But now what about politics? You just mentioned the politics, and I think one of the reasons is that the politics doesn't attract the brightest.
Well, that's true. And in fact, one of my proposals, which we'll come to later, I'm sure, in the book, I've got 10 proposals for how we can fix this schism, but also how we can actually create a more legitimacy around democracies. But one of the proposals that I think we should actually pay for politicians more money, not less, but also force them to justify.
How much more?
Well,
Singapore model?
Yeah, Singapore. It's funny you say that, because the Singapore model, people who don't know, the head of state in Singapore gets paid $1.4 million a year, but the ministers, so the ministers for the different departments, get 30 to 40% bonuses every year based on economic outcomes. So if they see improvements in GDP, but life expectancy, infant mortality, they will get paid bonuses. But critically, those bonuses can be clawed back in 10 years' time if they find that the politicians were actually fudging the numbers or inflating the economy. So, but just to your more important question a moment ago, why are we so skeptical? What is the concern? And there's a whole host of reasons people don't have faith in democracy in the way that they did in years, in the past. One of the problems is that they're concerned about voter participation rates being down. So in the United States, voter participation rates hover around 50%. For low-income families of around $30,000 per year, they're hovering at 30%. This is very far off of
so 90 million Americans didn't vote last
who
elections.
could have voted and who should have voted, and this is very far off.
So do you want to make it mandatory?
Well, again, that's one of the proposals. We'll come to that, but the point being that there is it's very far off from the one man, one vote mantra of democracy. But then also money has seeped into the political process. The New York Times reports that just 158 families in this country were responsible for 50% of the political contributions at the last presidential election. We've seen money going into lobbying double in the past 10 years, over the past 10 years, to now over $3 billion at every election. This is corrupting the system to such a place that when Americans were polled by Pew, 80% of Americans do not believe or do not trust the federal government to do what is right on a regular basis. The World Economic Forum has put out reports that show that across the world, citizens have more faith in authoritarian governments than they do democracies. And I can give you a whole host of examples. We're talking about Europe earlier, where the sense around populism, this backlash against essentially the failure of the pillars, executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, is leaving people with a lot of concern about the fate of democracy longer term.
Okay, so just let's shift from politics to economics again. In your book, you kept talking about the welfare state and about the growth of welfare state and about negative effect of that. And what caught my attention that though you came close, but you never used the word socialism. So, and I think it's probably worth talking about it, especially because now we're just 2 days away from the 200th anniversary of 200th birthday of Karl Marx. And May the 5th, so it has been celebrated quite broadly in Europe and in many other parts of the world. At a time where in this country, Bernie Sanders called himself socialist, made 13 million votes, and across the Atlantic, in the UK, unreformed socialists, or I would even call communists, Jeremy Corbyn now is 5 minutes away from Downing Street 10. So it's still in full control of the second largest party in the United Kingdom. And in many other countries, we could see the rise of the far left. In France, everybody paid attention to Marine Le Pen, who made 21-something% at presidential elections, but the far left candidate Mélenchon made nearly 20%. You also have a rise of the far left in Germany, alongside with Nazis, of course. So do you think that we should talk about socialism and about this bankrupt ideology? And the fact is that for many young people, Soviet Union and the socialism and all these ideological debates of the 20th century is as ancient as the siege of Troy?
Well, Well, you're right. I didn't, and you pointed out that I didn't mention the word socialism. It wasn't deliberate. I'm not an ideologue. In fact, I should have mentioned my parents are here from Zambia, and they've come all the way to be here. And so, and actually, they didn't raise us in an ideological home. So, you know, we were much more interested in debate on issues and I think essentially pick and choose what the best bits of politics and economics are in different states. So I'm not really going to be swayed by one more model or another. I do think, and I'm reminded of something that Margaret Thatcher said when she was prime minister. She said the problem with socialism is that you run out of other people's money. Yeah. And I think at a time where there is significant debt, I was just talking earlier today, as many of you maybe know, in this country, about 45% of Americans would have to borrow or sell something to get $400 for an emergency. I mean, that to me is completely unacceptable. This is, and by the way, this is 49.
You're talking about a real emergency. I saw this poll.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a dire necessity. Like, just the saving rights, buying some first medical aid.
Yeah. So, I mean, that is, to me, a state, and I should point out that survey was 45% of working adults in the United States. So this is not people who aren't working and unemployed, where you might say, okay, they would struggle to get money. This is working adults in this country would have to sell something to get $400 for an emergency. I mean, that to me really underscores the concerns around debt. And you know, if you look at the what they call ESHLA programs in Europe, the education, social housing, and local authority, we have inflated the government role of government, but also we've increased a significant amount of debt on the balance sheet. And without economic growth, which by the way, the IMF has stated we will never again see the rates of growth that we saw pre-2007, ever again, for a whole host of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. But if you have that backdrop, it makes it quite worrying to make promises to citizens and to voters without them really understanding what these trade-offs are from one generation to another.
Okay, you just mentioned the promises of the voters, but voters always react positively on big promises.
Yes.
So now, how realistic are these promises? So because everybody wants to have freebies.
Yeah.
So free education, free healthcare, and just you name it.
Yeah.
So what's the solution?
Well, I mean, I think they're unrealistic, unfortunately, partly because of the debt issue, partly because growth is slowing and slowed down. But also, I think that it's exacerbated or it's made more catalytic because the policy response of politicians is to become much more aggressive in terms of protectionism, to put on tariffs, and which we know actually slows growth and in fact did slow down the recovery in the United States after the Great Depression. We know that it increased the unemployment rate in this country, and essentially it also slowed down growth for many decades. So we know that that suite of policies is actually just going to drive things worse, not better. And I think that is something that perhaps people aren't familiar with.
But in your book you talked about the rise of authoritarian leaders because this model all of a sudden now looked attractive. And I think partially it's because the economic conditions, as you described, in America and in Europe, they are not as great as used to be, and people, they're not happy, and they're losing faith not only in politicians, but also in the political system. So what do you make of the rise of the Chinese model in the minds of especially young people? Also about the rise of Erdogan, Orban, set aside Putin. That's a separate story.
Don't mention the P word.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit simplistic to say the Chinese model. I think people in their minds, when they hear the word Chinese model, I think they have certain assumptions about what is actually at debate.
It's about in more interventionist policy of the state. So
well,
this is
it's beyond that. To me, it is a split in ideology, and maybe let me just iron it out, lay out what I mean. So in the West, Western living, Western culture, we hold the individual to be sacrosanct. That's the most important thing. That I have the right to do whatever I want as an individual, as long as I don't impinge on the rights of somebody else. And we have, by and large, decided that the social costs of my behavior as an individual are things we don't really focus on. So I can get drunk, I can behave recklessly, I can have 15 children if I want to, But that's fine because that's my choice. But there are social costs to that behavior. And unfortunately, and whether it's obesity, population growth, et cetera, in the West, those types of things are now essentially dragging down economic growth. But that's the Western model. So the individual's held sacrosanct, we protect that at all costs. Very different from the model in China, where essentially the political class has taken the view that humans are not to be trusted. We don't even trust them to take care of themselves as individuals, so what damage can they do for society as a whole? So given that the Chinese political class, given that they believe that human beings are not to be trusted, their model is to basically treat the society and community as sacrosanct and the most important thing, and they try to keep the human in check so that they don't undermine the whole economic and societal aspect. The reason I think this is interesting, and by the way, I didn't declare it, and I'm not an ideologue, but for me, I am drawn to democracy, I am drawn to market capitalism, but I think we are failing to convince people around the world, and I think it's because we're just no longer convincing. And I look at some of the innovations that the Chinese political class are embarking on, and I find them quite interesting, but I know they wouldn't work here because they're completely antithetical to Western values. I'll give you a quick example, if I may.
Okay, go, of course.
Sesame credits. So this is the idea that the Chinese government will give you credit as an individual if you do things that they think are value add for community. So for an example, Garry, if you spend the weekend teaching young people how to play chess, well, that's a good thing because those young people will not be engaged in bad behavior, they're learning a skill, they're learning strategic thinking, etc. That is good for society. As a reward for that behavior, the Chinese government will give you, I don't know, VIP tickets to watch Black Panther, or you'll be able to take your parents. If you had an ailing relative, you would be able to get access to the doctor or to medicine before other people because they say, hey, this guy is a good citizen.
It's kind of social currency.
Well, yeah, it's a social currency, exactly. But that, as I said, is completely antithetical to the way Americans and Westerners live. They would not want to have Big Brother saying, oh gosh, that was really good. You took your kids to play soccer, or your nephews to play badminton. And so in that regard, there's a deeper question than just superficially saying, oh, it's the state, with its arms around enterprise and asset allocation of labor and capital. That's true to some respect, but it's much deeper than that. And I would just say one last thing. The Chinese are ideological. They're ideological about economic growth. And every time I've been there, they say, oh, if you could prove to us that democracy and market capitalism could deliver economic growth in a sustained and equitable way over a long period of time, we'd adopt it tomorrow. The reason they've not adopted is that they don't believe that that's the case. And they look at the West today and they say, that is the source of the financial crisis, that is the source of political instability today, and that's why we don't like it. So I, for one, struggle to make the case for democracy and market capitalism, although I do, because there is a lot of skepticism, and people tend not to think about the innovation aspects and a lot of the good value that democracy and market capitalism can deliver, but they do worry a lot about these social costs.
Okay, that's interesting. So you just mentioned in the last sentence, innovations. So does it bother them that all the great things they use, invented in the free world?
Well, it's interesting because I mentioned the point about productivity. So productivity is essentially the amount of output per unit worker. So how much output is Dambisa producing? How much output is Garry producing? And they argue, it's kind of shorthand for claiming it's the whole state, but this is the idea that they put forward. They claim that in democratic societies, and I should have mentioned, productivity explains 60% of why one country grows and another one does not. So it's critically important in economics to focus on getting productivity right. The other 40% is labor and capital, but 60% will explain why one country is doing well and another one is not. But for them, they say in a democratic society, the voter is not stupid. The voter knows, actually, hang on, these politicians will continue to give me free stuff. They'll give me free goods and services, which is your welfare state / socialism point, as long as I vote for them. But the problem with that, it means that I as an individual, a rational voter, will stop working. And they claim, they and a lot of people in China claim that's exactly why we're seeing productivity decline. So the concern around innovation is that, yes, we're seeing innovation somewhat. We have seen significant innovations. But if you read work by Robert Gordon, for example, who's a professor at University of Chicago, he believes very strongly that the biggest advances in medicine and technology have actually already passed us. And that actually it takes 7 hours to fly from New York to London, and it was 7 hours to fly from New York to London 50 years ago. And so we are not making the leaps and bounds that people would like to see. And Peter Thiel has talked a lot about this in his book, 0 to 1, which buy after you buy my book. But the point just being, I think that these are the real issues at the heart of this.
Yeah, okay. You just mentioned the planes. It's a very painful issue for those who care about innovations, because when you look at the news planes, they're very comfortable. They feel efficient, but they even probably slower because they want to burn less fuel than the planes 30, 40 years ago. So basically, I'm afraid that in 10 years, my grandchildren will be flying the same planes as my grandparents.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, but why did it happen? So we had faster planes. We had Concorde,
yes,
and we could do many other things. But we made a conscious choice to substitute risk for safety. So basically, the speed for more comfort.
Yeah.
So now, what about that? So is it one of the fundamental problems that we're facing today, that we're no longer willing to take risk? So we're risk averse, we're complacent, and we just would like to sort of minimize the risk, but we still demand the same benefits.
Yeah, but that is an artifact of the political system, I would argue. I think that in a world where voters are less engaged and voters do not hold their politicians accountable, and actually in many respects the voters are not really that au fait with what the subtle issues are, the points that we're talking about, right, these trade-offs between today's generation and tomorrow's generation, those are not things that are in the lexicon of the average voter, and therefore they're very easily seduced to vote today for this person who is promising things that we know don't work. We know today that we don't have an answer for income inequality. We've tried to tax.
So we don't. I mean,
we absolutely
let's
do
slow
not.
down. We don't.
We absolutely do not. I'll tell you why, because it comes back to your point about long-term and short-termism. We've tried tax and redistribution, and that has failed. Income inequality has continued to widen, which is the more left-leaning approach: increase taxes and redistribute. We've also tried the right-leaning approach, which is supply side, keep taxes low, actually encourage people to innovate and create jobs. That has also been tried and has not stemmed the tide of widening income inequality. So what has worked? Well, what has worked is actually social mobility. That's essentially education. But what we do know today, and this is, again, you can verify, it's data in the book, but it's also very clearly a big issue in terms of public policy. We know that the probability of being born in one class, a low-income class in this country, and ending up in a higher economic class has halved, has gone down by 50% over the last several decades. Social mobility has been eroded considerably to such an extent that, according to the OECD, this generation of Americans, for the first time in the history of this country, which is 200 years old, is less educated than the preceding generation. It has never happened before. We are under-investing in education, and that, to me, is the biggest problem around income inequality. And unfortunately, we cannot redress that situation because our policymakers are so short-term, and education is a long-term issue.
So, but okay, now back to politics. So you had so many arguments. It's not defending, but explaining why a lot of people now are attracted by quote-unquote Chinese model. So let's stretch it. So what can we do with political system here and in Europe? Because we could see the same very dangerous trend that political center has been decimated. And it's not just American problem. You have rise of alt-right and you have rise of far left. You could see it in the UK. It's like a pendulum swinging from Brexit to Jeremy Corbyn. You have Mélenchon, Le Pen, AfD in France, AfD Die Linke in Germany. So what's the solution?
Yeah, so I think it's a brilliant question because there was a fantastic article a couple of weeks ago by David Brooks in the New York Times where he asked the exact question vis-a-vis the United States. He said, can we sort of think to the future? what does the world look like? What does the United States political system look like post-Trump? Do we revert to the mean and essentially re-elect somebody who's more mainstream, somewhere in the middle, or do we have a completely different fundamental shift in the terms of equilibrium? And his conclusion is that the best indicator of where the US political system will go is Italy, because Italy, as you recall, had Berlusconi, very similar in terms of temperament, a businessman, very media savvy.
No, he was a successful businessman.
Let's not go there. But also with a very colorful personal life, and he stayed in power. And what has happened in Italy is exactly as you described. It's now got two very extreme parties on the left and right. The middle has collapsed. And the government is essentially incapable of creating public policy. And part of the reason I wrote this book is because I think that the risk of democracies, if they continue to just trundle down the way they are, is that you either end up in a plutocracy where you have a handful of people essentially designing public policy. The US, I feel, has been trending in that direction with the numbers that I mentioned earlier. Or you end up in a more populist sphere where the government is essentially beholden to either left or right sentiment, and they're not actually able to design public policy, let alone focus on long-term economic challenges that I've just mentioned here today. And so this, to me, is really the greatest concern. And you did ask me, what can we do about it? So that I won't go through all 10 proposals, but the book specifically talks about 10 proposals on what we can do. It's everything from thinking about extending terms. I should point out that all the proposals in my book have precedent somewhere in the world. And I picked them deliberately because I knew people would roll their eyes and say, oh, we can't possibly have mandatory voting. Well, Australia has mandatory voting. 27 countries have mandatory voting. People are forced as citizens to participate in the economy. But also, I talk about capping terms. In the United States, I don't know if you're aware, Senator Byrd and Congressman Dingell in this country were in power for over 50 years. To me, it's indistinguishable from being an authoritarian state. And the question is, what did they actually do?
Quite a few, I think, U.S. senators that
but I mean, are we happy
stayed
with
in
that?
power for half a century.
Yeah, but it's very easy to point fingers at other places, countries that are blatantly non-democratic, and say, why do they have people staying in office for such a long time? But we have that situation here. I also talk about weighted voting.
Yeah, but it's more like exception, yes. If you talk about the Senate.
Well, I think the mean is probably not in the 50s, but it is definitely in the 20-year
Senate,
average.
yes.
So yeah.
Senate,
so
yes.
I mean, again, I don't think that's.
But what about two-party system?
Yeah, I think I talk about the two-party system. I think that is a handicap, and it's one of the things that I thought would have happened is that very wealthy people in this country who are on the left and on the right, I thought would have come together and formed a third party, given everything that's happened and the sort of discourse really being so split. I'm told that there were discussions, but that the egos were too big and everybody wanted to be president and did this third party, but that would be one option, I think.
Yeah, I was very happy that you became a signatory of organization I helped to found here a year ago, the Renew Democracy Initiative. So yesterday I had my op-ed in the Daily News, so explaining the concept of the organization, which was you can summarize as saying, make politics sane again, or to be more sort of specific as to revive the political middle, and we hope that we could create some gravitas for, as you said, for rational people to get together. But it seems to me that, as I said, it's the ambition standing in the way, and also it's what I think stands in the way. Is just the two-party system is doomed to produce more radicalism.
Yes.
In its current form, because in all primaries, so you have to go to the left on one side and to the right on the other side, because all the challenges they attack you from the fringes. And general elections, in most cases, that's when you look at the districts, they're just gerrymandered, and it's all could be easily predicted. So again, these things are connected to economy, and it's just probably it's time for you to start, telling us more about solutions.
Yes. So I think I've touched on the economic solutions. These are really, they need to be more long-term. Education, to me, is a no-brainer. McKinsey, the global consulting firm, put out a report a few years ago where they claim that by 2050, which is not that far along away, that the underinvestment in education in this country, in minority groups, blacks and Latinos and Asians, who will be the majority, minority majorities by 2050, will actually put this country in a permanent recession. So meaning we have sat around and we've underinvested in education for such a long time for a significant and growing part of the population. And that to me is an obvious...
But don't you think that this education has just, it's an immediate problem that we have to call? Because it's still based on an assumption that, you have to bring kids through K-12, the colleges, and at the end of the day, we believe that this education will offer them a chance, a good chance to get a job. But now things change just rapidly. And so what's the point of actually going through all this process that is no different from one that was in place 150 years ago, to make them by age 22, 23, 24, so facing challenges in their lives without financial security, and most of them having tremendous debt on their shoulders.
So, I mean, once again, I'm not wed to the education system as it stands, and I think there is a lot of opportunity for innovation in education given technology and given the needs for whatever the new economy will be, whether it's a gig economy, a tech-based economy. I can see that there are many other routes to retool and reskill people in that world. I mean, the African population will be 40% of the world's population by 2075, and that is a massive impact for the globe if we are thinking about educating people in a sort of very tightly sort of structured way. I think that it's a very different proposition if we can think about technology as delivering information and delivering knowledge through a different platform.
Yeah, but what about the new technology? So how does it affect it? Because it's we don't live anymore in static society. So it's I think that's we're facing the end where at the edge of this era of status quo. Exactly, at the edge of chaos. So, but chaos is also an opportunity.
Yes. So the technology point may be just worth giving a little bit of context. So in 1900 in this country, 60% of Americans were involved in agriculture. So in some fashion, so just think about that. That's the majority of the workforce.
120 years ago.
Today, that's just that. I mean, it's not today. It's less than 2% of the American population, and we know what happened. So people moved out of agriculture into manufacturing, and from manufacturing into the service sector. So today, about 80% of Americans are in the service sector. A little less than 20% are involved in the manufacturing sector, and it's been because of automation, push and pull factors, but people basically moving out of one sector into another sector. So you're right. The real challenge we have right now is that technology is disintermediating jobs. In fact, there's a paper that came out of Oxford Martin School in 2013 where they claimed that by 2030, which is just around the corner, 47% of jobs in this country will have gone. And actually, I mean, I run marathons for fun. I bring down the African average just in case anybody's wondering. Never in the front. But there's a McDonald's near my house. I know nobody wants to admit that they go into McDonald's. I go into McDonald's. And I've been going there for years, and I just realized actually you can walk in and not talk to anybody anymore. You can go in, I don't know if you should try and do this sometime. But walk in, there's a big machine, you type in what you want, and it adds and subtracts. Swipe your card, and somehow miraculously the food comes out. And I think to myself, gosh, where are all the human beings? And that's the service sector. And you know what I'm talking about, because this is true in supermarkets, certainly in Britain, and across Europe. It's true at the airports, fewer and fewer jobs in the service sector. But what's going to happen to all those workers? And the big concern is that what happens to those workers at a time when there's no other sector to absorb them as it has been in the past. Now, I served on a technology board in Silicon Valley, and technology people would roll their eyes in the boardroom whenever I'd say this. And they'd say, "What are you doing? Why are you being so negative? There's another sector. Yes, we can't tell you what the sector is, but you have to have faith that there's another sector that will absorb all these workers." Well, John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s predicted that we'll have a 15-hour work week by 2050. again, which is not that far away. Usually people cheer when they think about a 15-hour work week. But the question that he asked is, well, what are we going to do with all that spare time? And his conclusion was that we'll be pondering God. So I hope that he is right.
So anything more productive?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway, I am an eternal optimist. The book half of the book is on solutions. I think that the economics model itself has to reform and evolve, and I think moving away from these, it has to be this or this, into a much more mixed model. Scandinavian model has got some good evidence in some of the metrics that we care about, income inequality, for example. The problem with those models is those countries are very small, so people worry that you can't replicate them. But I think that we have to move away from being so doggedly stuck in believing in things that may actually have significant second-order effects.
Okay, speaking about reforms and about both political and economic, so let's just have a quick word about France. Because in France, many believed it was a miraculous solution, the young president coming out of blue, doing something that many believed was just insane, defying both, not two parties, there are many parties in France, but both flanks of the political elite, and he's a president today. So do you think this model can work in this country or in other places? And B, so do you think he'll succeed in actually changing French economy that is also suffering from the problems of the past, the very powerful trade unions, and believes that the state owes to people more than it can produce?
Well, somebody really tried hard to convince me yesterday. I had lunch with a friend who lives in Paris. Now, I lived in Paris for a little bit, and he said to me, even if President Macron does not win another election, he's done enough damage in a good way to actually reboot the economy and to reshift. I mean, obviously, he's taken on the railways, SNCF, and that his point is just that it's once the boogeyman is out there, it's clear for everybody that reform is necessary. So even if it's not going to be him to lead them into the promised land, they think that he's done enough damage.
Good. It's a positive note. Now we can move to the Q&A segment of our program tonight. Okay, let's start there. So just because you're next.
You mentioned that productivity has been on the decline, and that seems counterintuitive given all the automation and technological advances. One, how do you explain it? And two, are we using the right metrics for the shifting economy?
It's a brilliant question. I actually wrote an article in the Financial Times a few weeks ago on this very question, because one of the points that I made was that it might just be purely mismeasurement, meaning if you think about how electricity came to be. So you had Benjamin Franklin with the kite, gets electricity, he sees, gets lightning strikes the kite, but to go from that to having a grid where we're able to just flick a light switch and the lights come on and be able to sort of manage electricity for commercial use as well as household use, that took multiple decades. And so we may very well be in a period of time where in 10, 15 years, we'll see a pickup in productivity, but it doesn't necessarily get away from this deeper concern around maybe whether the Chinese are right, because I didn't mention in Britain today, a friend of mine runs one of the largest mid-range retailer, sort of Target there, and he was telling me that his customers, for him, his customers basically derive 60 to 70% of their living standards or living lifestyle from the government. So education is paid for, healthcare is paid for, transportation is paid for, they get food stamps. And so think about that. That is a relatively more capitalist society. And that's this question about whether it's actually the democratic process that's leading into these productivity declines. The last little point I'll mention, just another quick example, is Wikipedia. I'm sure we've all used Wikipedia. Nobody gets paid for that, but there's clearly value that we might not just be adding, but it's a very good question.
Here's Mike.
Oh, thanks. First of all, I totally agree with one of your proposals that mandatory voting is a must. because I've done a couple of studies of that, and all you need to elect the president of the United States is 150 people, 3 in each state. I mean, that doesn't sound like a workable system. The other thing, I went to a forum on the future of capitalism, the future of work, at the Murphy Institute last week, and Heidi Scheinholz was talking about that automation is not going to reduce jobs. So that's something to look at. I mean, there's so much stuff going on. The third thing is one of your proposals a GMI, guaranteed minimum income? Because they've had talks about that. So it seems to be, you have to become a great chess player to play all these parts and to see what one, for the end game. So maybe, Garry, you could...
Look, unfortunately, that's, the game of chess is based on the rules. And here,
So I guess the GMIs, the guaranteed basic income, the universal basic income, that to me falls in the camp of tax and redistribution, because that's essentially what it is. But it does also beg the broader question of what should society care about? Do we care about relative incomes, or do we care about the absolute income? Meaning, are we happy if everybody lives at a certain basic standard of living? So maybe each get $2,000 a month, or whatever the amount. Maybe it's $100,000 a month if you live in New York, but some crazy amount of money. But or are we worried about relative income? So this point that we should care that today the 8 wealthiest men, they are all men, have more money than the bottom 50% of the world's population. Do we care about that? Should it matter? So it really is about what the society cares about. Now, I think in a society where social mobility is possible, the American dream, and people were actually making progress, and people were willing to sacrifice because they had children, and children have a better life. Nobody really cared about income inequality. But now in a world where people feel that there are rules that are stacked against them, and that this society is actually not as transparent and as fair as we might have thought, and where social mobility is declining, I think that the issues around income inequality and whether the viability of a GMI would work, I think still comes into question.
Wow. So let's move to that side. So just, otherwise we'll be leaning right.
Thank you. So I was just wondering if I could have some of your thoughts on socioeconomic segregation and the implications for the kind of investment in education that you were talking about, and basically the way that we can make sure that educational opportunities are available to children across different neighborhoods to allow them to become more socially mobile.
So it's hard for me to comment in grave detail because it's not my area, but I will say that there are many hallmarks of the aid industry, and we promised we weren't going to bring up debt aid, but I'm just going to throw out a comment. I think there are a lot of parallels that I see in the aid industry where there's vested interests and there's short-sightedness. There's a sense that we're constantly putting on Band-Aid solutions and not really getting in there to solve these long-term issues. I see a lot of those mirror images in the education system here. So, I think in many jurisdictions, people are essentially being held hostage by teacher unions, etc., in a way that actually doesn't hold them accountable for poor education performance. The OECD statistics around the PISA program, so the Program for International Student Assessment, has shown that the United States and other developed countries have slid in the rankings in mathematics, reading, and science. We know these statistics, but it's at a time where the United States, on a per capita basis, is still ranked in the in the #1 position in terms of the dollar amount that they're spending, but obviously the quality of that amount of money and how it's being distributed in terms of the allocation, I think there are deeper issues that need to be addressed. And obviously, given the forecasts that I mentioned earlier, I think it makes it urgent. I will just point out one last thing, which has always disturbed me as somebody who comes from a continent, that African continent, which has always been described, or there's a narrative of poverty, disease, war, and corruption, and yet for as long as, I went to Harvard in 97, graduated in 1997, and for as long as since I left that program, over 97% of the blacks that go to the Ivy League schools in this country are from Africa and the Caribbean. And I think that, if nothing else, is an indictment of the education system here. Because if you essentially have a population of black students coming from the Africa and the Caribbean, these are the poorest places in the world, and you are neglecting your own population, I think that really says a lot about public policy and unfortunately around the social spending issue.
Just as you mentioned a few times OECD, since we're in America, it's just the organization of economic cooperation development in Europe. So,
yeah, so basically it's a club of rich countries.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Just next to you.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the premise is not that we're going to fix democracy, whether democracy can actually work, whether it's really just two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. But as far as looking at what the biggest thing that could be fixed, what about the monetary system and the banks? So the way the banking system works is, let's say you're the banker. There's three different ways in which you are advantaging the first receiver of that money. And that is the knowledge that the money supply is going to be increased, so then those who have that knowledge can act in the marketplace. Two, the first receivers of that money get that money and then are able to buy essentially goods in the marketplace at a discount, because everybody else who receives that money subsequently has to pay an inflated price in comparison to those who receive it earlier in what's known as a Cantillon effect. The third way is that you get to choose who receives that money first. So obviously, production of money is inherently political, and we did not have that in the United States throughout the entire history of our country. We had that for a good portion without it, and if you look at the highest productivity levels, when we did not have the government producing the money, the productivity levels and the innovation levels were actually at the highest. Could you comment, please?
I know what the literature you're tapping into, and I know that debate, and I'm sympathetic to the argument in some respects. What I will say is that the banking system itself is going through an innovation, but I think also the proposal that you just laid out, it's a little bit, to me, it's just a little bit too conspiratorial for me to buy into. I happen to serve on the board of a bank. I don't think people are sitting behind a dark curtain in sort of that sort of playing. Maybe they are. Maybe I'm just not part of that discussion. That's quite possible.
I made no mention of a conspiracy. I talked about simply the effects of money production.
No, I do understand that, and obviously, given what has subsequently happened with the inflation or money printing seigniorage over the last decade because of the financial crisis, I know why people have that view. But what I am saying as well is that I think that if you're asking me whether we should have printed money, the answer to me is yes, because I think things would have been much worse than they were. If you're asking me whether I think that the gains of the stock market in the last few years have actually accrued to people who have capital, and people who are wage workers have seen a deterioration of their real wages, that is also true. I do think there's some fundamental questions that you are essentially tapping into, but I'm not entirely sure quite yet whether I would necessarily characterize the monetary supply system or money supply system as you have described it. And by the way, maybe maybe the question in some respects is moot if we do see cryptocurrencies come in, and if we do see Bitcoin, etc., these types of currencies dominate, then I think that then there is a real issue where it becomes irrelevant. But I'm sympathetic to some respects.
Here. Now, just before what about too big to fail?
What about it?
Do you approve it?
So I did write a book called How the West Was Lost, which is my mother's favorite, actually, of the books that I write. But the reason I think that was an important book is that too many people, and I think the narrative around the bankers are bad, basically they're these evil people playing casino, it's a bit more complicated than that.
I know, I agree, yes, but it's too big to fail. So does the state have obligations to save big enterprises?
Well, it's not big enterprises. The too big to fail argument was really about financial institutions. It became, of course, Ford, Motor Company, etc. But in some respects, I do think they do. And I'm not a big government person.
Every time.
Well, I don't think it's every time. I think it depends on what the circumstances are. And this is what my point was going to be around too big to fail and around the financial crisis. The financial crisis, people don't seem to fully appreciate that the government was in cahoots with the banks. The government in this country and around Western society had promised a suite of public goods, education, housing, and don't forget, most importantly, housing for all. Which is a mainstay policy both of Republicans and Democrats in this country going back into the 1940s. That policy, designed to basically ensure that every American had a roof over their head and owned a home, is what actually was the impetus for government going to banks and saying, listen here, we want you to lend to our citizens and we will back you, we'll backstop you. Now, being on the board of a bank, I can tell you that, and by the way, this is a really important point because even today I often think to myself, if I had been on the board at that time, what decision would I have made? And the truth is, because the government said, you have a license to trade, I'm allowing you to exist because I as a regulator, I as the government, I'm allowing you to exist. It meant that many banks were giving out money, lending money to people that they knew couldn't afford to actually to pay back. But it was also because the government said, listen, we will backstop you. If something were to happen, we will bail you out because the banking system creates systemic risk, and we don't want to have systemic risk floating around the world or certainly around the economy, global economy. So in essence, my concern is that the banks have been made out to be bad guys. They did parcel and repackage the risk so that and passed it on. That was probably a little bit naughty. But the bottom line is that they were very much involved with the government. And the truth is, I mean, without naming names, there were some CEOs of banks who said, this thing smells bad, I don't really like it. But their returns and the business that they were creating was much less than the other banks and institutions that were involved. And so the shareholders, many of them pension funds where we've put our money, started to call up those CEOs and say, why are you not investing in mortgages? Why are you not in subprime? And so, listen, we bought our McMansions, we went on our great holidays. A lot of people benefited from a system that was quite corrosive. And as I said to you earlier, when we were in the green room, I'm always fascinated by Mark Twain's quote, it's not, or he said it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that's just not so. And I think that encapsulates what happened in the financial crisis because it wasn't something that we didn't know. It was just that we relied on a system that actually was just not so.
Okay, go ahead.
The tendencies towards authoritarian regimes, how would you characterize them? They happen in some countries voluntarily or like the process itself, because, for example, the elections of Putin showed that majority of Russians voluntarily voted for him. And in other countries, how does this happen? And what are the pros and cons of authoritarian regimes and democracies?
So, I have always tended to take the view that economics, I mentioned earlier, economics matters more than politics. And in that world, I think that economics is a prerequisite for democracy. If you want to have a democracy that's thriving and functioning, you have to have a middle class that's able to hold the government accountable. Pravorsky, who is a professor at NYU, has written a great paper. He's actually designed a model that predicts how long democracies can last in different countries based on per capita incomes. His numbers are a bit outdated, but he says at $6,000 per capita, then you're only above that threshold will your democracy survive come hell or high water, as he says. Anything below that, you'll see what happens in places like India or Thailand, where we see the parliaments where people are beating each other up. It's just not a public policy arena where there's actually deliverables. And so I'm quite sympathetic to that view. I think that if we get the economics right, I think that we get the politics that creates a democracy. In terms of the comparison, as I mentioned earlier, the volumes have been written about countries that are blatantly non-democratic. And so I've actually stayed away from that literature a lot in my new book. I talk a little bit about it, but not so much. And I think that it's a false dichotomy in some respects, because really I think the answer is somewhere in the middle for these countries.
Yeah, since Putin was mentioned, so I think it's a good moment to just to stop the conversation. I always feel annoyed, hearing about elections in Russia. That's people voluntarily voted for him. Yes, I'm sure if you have elections now in Damascus, Bashar al-Assad will make 100%. Yeah, I'm still, just proud that to see that so many Russians are just not happy with that. And if you want to ask a question, is Putin popular? Look at the pictures from protest on May the 5th. So when they were just going after kids. So after this protest, we had a very sad joke in Russia, Russian internet, what's left of free internet in Russia, is that it's an advice for parents who are taking their kids to the World Cup, soccer World Cup in Russia. So if your kid get lost, teach him to shout in Russian, Putin wor, Putin thief, and police will find him instantly. So, okay, thank you very much. So I hope it was entertaining and educational. Thank you, Dambisa. Thank you.